Welcome to this installment of True Crime Story Time, where I'll recap and examine interesting cases from the American justice system. I'm Taharka X. I do my best to report each case accurately and in a way that doesn't disrespect victims or the people that love them. Tonight, a twisted killer's love of cinnamon gum solves a grisly murder. Let's get into it. On August the 12th, 1996, Lieutenant Douglas Schlegel of the Eastern Pennsylvania Police Department sat in a small interview room just yards away from 19-year-old Corey Mayweather, who was in custody for a bizarre assault on a woman named Kathy Segusti. Mayweather was known to run with a ragtag group of thugs calling themselves the Cash Money Boys, and Segusti had been one of their drug customers. The gang often hung out at her house, even sleeping and receiving mail there on occasion. A week ago, she contacted police and reported that Mayweather and another member of his gang had accused her of stealing drugs. Though she had denied stealing and had tried to convince them of her loyalty, the argument had quickly escalated into a beating and then into something else. Kwame Henry, a member of the Cash Money Boys, had taken a kitchen knife and stabbed Segusti in the arm. He then heated a wire clothes hanger on the stove, shook salt on it, and used it to burn her. According to Kathy, he then told Mayweather to get the razors. There was another woman at Segusti's house that day whose initials are A.E., and she had also been accused of stealing drugs. She too was beaten and stabbed in the shoulder. When she heard Kwame Henry say something about razors, she dove through a partially open window, creating such a clatter that the men ran away from the house. Mayweather was taken into custody shortly after the report. A warrant had been issued for Henry's arrest. Schlegel wasn't there to talk about the assault on Segusti and A.E. He had Mayweather brought over from the jail because of something Segusti claimed had happened on July 8th, over a month ago. She said on that occasion, a 19-year-old woman named Mataron Smith had been hanging out at her place when suddenly Kwame, Mayweather, and another member of the gang named Stanley Obus accused her of stealing from them. Mataron Smith wasn't a member of the gang, but she ran with them and did whatever they needed her to do. Sometimes she sold drugs, sometimes she shoplifted. She also used drugs, and the men said she was dipping into their supply to feed her habit. Kathy Segusti had told police that Henry had punched Smith and knocked her backwards over her chair. The men then dragged her down into Segusti's basement, where Mayweather and Henry began to torture her. She said that Stanley Obus had a crush on Smith at the time, so he just sat at the top of the basement stairs, crying. Mayweather was running up and down the stairs to fetch various items for Henry, for example, a turkey baster and extension cords from the kitchen, and to heat up untwisted coat hangers on the stove. Segusti reported hearing Smith crying and begging the men to stop whatever it was they were doing. The whole time, she said, Mayweather was laughing and goading Henry on. Eventually, the screaming and crying stopped. Segusti saw the men carrying a large box that had been in the basement out of the house. That was the last time she'd ever seen Mataron Smith. 2 days after Segusti and A.E.'s reports, the police went through the trash at Segusti's house. In it, they found plastic bags and vials used for drugs, pieces of extension cords, burnt, misshapen wire hangers, metal tubing with burn marks on both ends, and some greeting cards addressed to Obus and Henry. All these items seemed to back up the women's stories. Police still had a problem with Segusti's story, however. They couldn't find anyone in Pennsylvania named Mataron Smith that even remotely fit the description she'd given. 19 years old, African American and 5'2", who sometimes went by the name Buffy. There were no missing persons reports in the nationwide database of anyone by that name either. But they couldn't just write off the story as the ramblings of a troubled woman addicted to drugs. When they talked to people in that area, they knew Mataron, or Buffy. There was a barmaid who said she kicked Smith out of the club a few times for being underage. There were street people that knew her, but no one could say where she was from or whether or not she had a family. They said that Mataron Smith didn't want the details of her life to be known. She wanted to make money and party. Furthermore, some of Kathy Segusti's neighbors had seen two men struggling with a large box on the day of the alleged murder. They said that the men slid the large box over the guardrail and carried it into a bushy area where there was a creek. The creek ran alongside a path that led to a cemetery. Just 2 days ago, on August the 10th, a groundskeeper had noticed that the door to one of the dead houses had been left open. Dead houses were once used to temporarily store bodies during the winter when the ground was too frozen to dig proper graves. The dead houses in this cemetery hadn't been in use for some time. The groundskeeper told police that he already knew what he'd find before entering the vault. It was 76 degrees that day, and the smell of dead flesh was overwhelming. When he went inside, he saw the box tipped on its side. The body of a female was half in the box and half on the floor, partially covered by newspaper and a cloud of flies. I've seen the photos of the crime scene, and they're some of the worst I've ever come across. Her pants are partially pulled down. There's a small piece of rope tied to one of her wrists, and flies and maggots are just embedded in her skin, feasting on the flesh. The groundskeeper called police, who immediately roped off the area and began taking photographs and collecting evidence. The body was taken along with the box to the coroner's office. Dr. Zachary Lysick was a Northampton County coroner back in 1996. He said that the body was in a very advanced state of decomposition by the time she was found. Some of the smaller bones of the body, for example, those found in the neck, were completely missing. It was impossible to tell if she had been sexually assaulted or even what had killed her. But the rope around her wrist and the fact that she was hidden in a vault was enough for him to realize that this was a homicide. Officially, her exact cause of death is still unknown. The police had returned to the vault the next day to see if there was anything else they could find that would tell them who Mataron Smith was and where she came from. They collected dead leaves, a couple pieces of the newspapers that had been left behind when the body was removed, a size 34 waist pair of jockey underwear, a sandwich bag with Vaseline in it, and a chewed up wad of cinnamon gum. There was no doubt that the body in the vault was the person that had been in Segusti's house. The box she was found in and the newspapers proved that. But when the coroner examined the victim's teeth, they discovered that this wasn't a 19-year-old woman. This was a 13-year-old girl who matched the description of a runaway from Baldwin, Long Island. Her name was Richezza Williams. Now, when Schlegel had questioned Mayweather about assaulting Segusti and A.E., he noticed that the young man kept unwrapping pieces of big red gum, chewing them for a few minutes, then spitting them out and opening another piece. So when the CSI listed a piece of cinnamon gum in the evidence log, Schlegel immediately thought of Mayweather. The police lucked out with that piece of gum. It was still perfectly shaped to a person's teeth, almost like a mold that a dentist would make. The CSI text said that the gum must have dropped out of his mouth when he was in the vault. If he had spit it out, it would have changed the shape of the gum and they wouldn't have been able to use it to match up to his teeth. At first, Mayweather refused to allow the police to make a mold of his teeth. But then they showed him the instrument they were going to use to pry his mouth open and take the mold by force, and he complied. Keep in mind, listeners, that at this point, Mayweather doesn't know they have a body. He hasn't been charged with anything except assaulting Sagusti. All he knew was that first they had a warrant to make a mold of his teeth, and now all of a sudden he was back in the interrogation room. He also doesn't know the truth about Mataron Buffy Smith, that she was actually just 13 years old. And although he knew that she was originally from New York, he didn't know she'd run away from home. The dental records made it possible for Richezza Williams' family to finally know what had become of her. She had been missing for almost 5 months, but there were problems even before that. Richezza is described by a former teacher as bright and enthusiastic, eager to participate. After a death in her family, they moved from Brooklyn to Baldwin on Long Island, which is where she met Mayweather and Henry. Richezza also began dating a 21-year-old drug dealer around the same time. She started sneaking out at night. She fell asleep in class and eventually stopped going to school altogether. She ran off with her boyfriend. She used a fake ID to rent an apartment claiming to be 21 years old. The apartment manager later said that there was a lot of coming and going from the apartment and that he suspected they were selling drugs. But Richezza's boyfriend got arrested running drugs into New York and had to serve time there. So Obus, Mayweather, Henry, and Williams carried on without him. According to people that knew Mataron Smith, she had quickly developed a very heavy crack cocaine addiction as well. Lieutenant Schlegel informed Mayweather that they had him. He had a unique pattern to the two teeth that had bitten down on that gum. CSI had made molds of both the gum and his teeth, and they fit together perfectly like a puzzle. He told him that was just one of the major pieces of evidence against him. Corey Mayweather asked for a cigarette, which Schlegel provided. He then calmly told a frankly self-serving story in which he admitted to being at Sagusti's home on the day of Richezza's death, but not to having participated. He said he was the one that was sitting at the top of the stairs while Henry and Stanley Obus tortured Richezza in the basement. He said that Henry specifically told him not to come into the basement because he didn't want him to see the awful things that they were doing. He admitted running upstairs to grab those items for the men in the basement and to heating up wire hangers on the stove. At one point, Mayweather claimed, he did come down there, and he saw Richezza Williams curled up in a ball against the washing machine. Her shirt was torn open, and the skin on her chest was burnt and peeling. He said she asked him to help her, and that he replied, I can't, or I'll get beat up. When asked how Richezza Williams had been killed, Mayweather said that he wasn't aware that she had been killed. He said that eventually the crying and pleading stopped, and he thought that they were just finished doing whatever it was they were doing to her. He said that if they had killed her, they probably just cut her throat. He denied knowing anything about a large box or moving anything out of the basement. In fact, he claimed to have just seen Mataron at a party 2 days before he was arrested. Corey Mayweather, Stanley Obus, and Kwame Henry were all charged with murdering Richezza Williams. Corey was represented by defense attorney Philip Lauer, whose first act was to try to suppress the interview he'd given Lieutenant Schlegel. The attempt failed. Judge F.B. Kimberly McFadden ruled that if the case went to trial, the jury would hear the entire interview. In April of 1998, Corey Mayweather pled guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for murder, plus 20 years for conspiracy to commit homicidal violence and 10 years for kidnapping. It had taken nearly 2 years for the case to make its way through the courts. He was 21 years old. During his sentencing, Richezza's parents screamed and cursed at him for torturing their daughter. Then, as her mother egged him on, a man that identified himself as her father rushed forward and actually grabbed Mayweather. The bailiffs pulled them apart before he could do much else. Both parents were charged with disorderly conduct. They were made to pay a fine of $73 each, and they wrote letters of apology to the court. Kwame Henry was apprehended in Trinidad the same year. Agents reported that he seemed shocked when they arrested him. Unlike Corey Mayweather, Henry's case went all the way to trial. In June of 1999, he was convicted of all charges and given the same sentences as Mayweather. Richezza's parents were not notified when Henry was sentenced. In July of 1999, Corey Mayweather tried to appeal his conviction even though he had pled guilty. His argument was that there simply wasn't enough evidence for him to ever have been charged with those offenses in the first place. The court disagreed. In their response, they said that there was overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The appeals court did find that he had been sentenced improperly for the conspiracy charge. They shortened his sentence on that count alone from 40 to 20 years in prison, but left his life sentence for murder in place. But Mayweather wasn't done yet. In 2012, some years after the U.S. Supreme Court made changes to the guidelines for juvenile offender sentencing, he appealed to have his sentence reviewed. His public defender asked the court to be removed from the case before it was even put on the calendar because she knew he had no case at all. Corey Mayweather was 19 years old at the time of the murder, but in his paperwork he argued that since we know that a 17-year-old's brains are not fully developed, there's a good chance that a 19-year-old's aren't either. He said he should be treated just like the 15 and 17-year-old offenders. The appeal was denied. Then, in 2019, Mayweather tried to appeal under the Pennsylvania Post-Conviction Relief Act. This is basically an indirect appeal wherein the defendant asks a court to take a third look at their conviction after their direct appeals have failed. Again, his court-appointed lawyer sent a letter of no merit to the judge and asked to be let off the case. The post-conviction relief is only available within a year of having lost your appeal. Mayweather was 20 years too late. Kwame Henry had the same luck with his appeals. His direct appeals failed, and he tried to use the Post-Conviction Relief Act in March of 2019, about 16 years too late. Stanley Obus has never been caught and remains on the FBI's most wanted list. When you read about this case, most of the police quoted believe that he was a target of street justice for killing and torturing a child and has been dead for a long time. We don't know that for certain. It surprises me that a 13-year-old child could fool an observant, sober person into thinking that she was an adult. But the people she ran with were all drug addicts and hustlers. They were probably more interested in what she could do for them than finding out who she really was. She was running the streets at all hours of the night when she was in New York, so Mayweather and Henry would have had no reason to think she was so young. It's also clear there were some serious problems in Richezza's home. 12 and 13-year-old children don't choose to run the street hustling dope and prostituting rather than sleep in their own warm, safe beds at night unless there's something they feel they're getting out in the street that they're not getting at home. Perhaps the way the parents acted at the sentencing hearing is a clue. This is a sad case and a cautionary tale. Young people are so quick to trust other young people. They never consider that one of their peers would actually kill them. They always think it's some older person. But unfortunately, it happens all the time. Please let me know what you think in the comments section. It's been my pleasure presenting this case to you. Please join me again for more true crime story time. I'm Taharka X. Good night.